Bom dia a todas, bom dia a todos. Quero desejar para todos os estudantes, professores, as boas-vindas aqui no nosso evento, a aula inaugural, ou melhor, a aula magna do nosso semestre, do programa de pós-graduação em Ciência da Religião da PUC de São Paulo. Normalmente nós costumamos fazer este evento mais no início dos semestres letivos, mas por vários contratempos compreensíveis nessa situação que nós vivemos, tivemos de adiar este evento, mesmo porque nós queríamos trazer aqui um professor que tem trabalhado, tem discutido a questão da violência, a questão do sacrifício, o lugar do sacrifício e o conceito, inclusive o conceito de violência, tendo como pano de fundo a ideia do sacrifício. E então nós tivemos a oportunidade de contactar o professor Clemens Cavallin. Ele é professor na Universidade Nord, na Noruega, sueco, mas trabalha na Noruega, e ele está aqui conosco hoje, ao vivo, mas para facilitar o nosso trabalho aqui, nesta manhã, o professor Clemens enviou-nos a sua aula gravada, pedimos a ele que gravasse uma aula, o professor Fábio fez as legendas todas, então nós...
Opa, agora voltou.
Ok.
Voltou.
Estamos ao vivo. O professor Frank vai fazer a mediação com o professor Clemens, no momento da interação, das perguntas. E, bom, eu espero que a gente tenha aí uma bela manhã de aprendizagem. Ontem eu tive a oportunidade de assistir o vídeo e realmente é um tema fascinante. O tema da questão do sacrifício, violência e sacrifício é fascinante. Eu tenho certeza que será de muito proveito para todos, para todas. E vamos ter aqui uma rica manhã de conversa com o professor Clemens, tá bem? Where is the Professor Clemens? Professor Clemens, nice to meet you. You're welcome here in our program of religious studies. I will give the word to Frank. Frank can introduce you to our students. Then I hope a good session of knowledge here. Ok, Frank, please.
Obrigado, Edin. Seja bem-vindo, Clemens Cavallin. Bom dia para todas e todos para este evento especial. No primeiro momento, gostaria de agradecer ao Fábio Stern por ter conseguido convencer o professor Cavallin de fazer parte do nosso evento, essa aula magna, que é realmente uma aula magna, né? Uma grande aula no meio do semestre que talvez seja interessante no sentido de ganhar novas energias para o resto do semestre. Eu vou fazer uma pequena introdução para que vocês saibam com que vocês estão tendo essa aula magna. O professor, o nome já foi citado, Clemens Cavallin, ele é sueco, nasceu na Suécia, formou-se na cidade de Gothenburg, tem uma grande universidade lá, na área de História das Religiões e, paralelamente, nas artes visuais, na Valand Academy, né? Na Academia Valand, que é na mesma cidade. Então, ele fez essas duas formações, História das Religiões e arte visual. Mais tarde, começou a estudar sânscrito, paralelamente se inscreveu no programa de doutorado na Universidade de Gothenburg e terminou seu estudo de doutoramento em 2002 com uma tese sobre a eficácia do sacrifício. Então, ele vai agora, esse fundo que ele criou por si mesmo, né, tirar alguns aspectos e apresentar esses elementos para nós hoje naquela palestra que está por vir. Nesta tese, ele estudou os Brahmanas, que são textos antigos da literatura védica, que são manuais dos rituais, onde muito relacionado à questão do sacrifício védico, uma das partes mais antigas do hinduísmo. Entre 2003 e 2006, né, 2003 e 2006, ele mudou-se para a cidade de Bergen, onde tem uma grande universidade, uma tradição profunda de ciência da religião, onde ele fez parte do corpo docente, onde ele trabalhou na área também da história das religiões. Depois voltou para a Universidade de Gothenburg, onde lecionou e pesquisou sobre religiões asiáticas. Tive um semestre não sabático, mas ele foi convidado como professor visitante no Haverford College, nos Estados Unidos. E desde 2020, ele vive em Bodø, uma cidade na Noruega, onde trabalha também uma universidade localizada nessa cidade, chama-se Universidade North University. Ele vai falar sobre sacrifício ou violência, e este vídeo, né, com legendas, vai aparecer agora, vai demorar mais ou menos 21 minutos, e depois temos a possibilidade de fazer um debate, né, conforme as condições formais dessa plataforma. Vocês podem deixar suas perguntas, comentários, por favor, no chat, e o Fábio vai, tecnicamente, depois transmitir algumas perguntas que nós vamos discutir com o Clemens. Thank you very much, Professor Clemens. We are going to present now your video. Thank you so much for this. And then we are going to have a discussion. Everybody is already informed about the procedure. And then let's start with the video, please.
There is a close connection between the theme of violence and that of sacrifice. According to most definitions, a sacrifice, in contrast to an offering in general, requires that the offered object, a weapon, an animal, or a human being, is destroyed, which in the case of animals often means that the throat is slit and the body cooked, grilled, or burned whole, or driven into the desert with the prospect of certain death, as a scapegoat of Old Testament Judaism. The broader category of offerings, on the other hand, encompasses also incense rising to the heavens, the scattering of rose petals, libations of milk, water, and wine. Sacrifice undoubtedly revolves around the shedding of blood, the life force of the goat, sheep, or bull, partly or in toto given to the deity. As in Temple Judaism or the Old Norse religion, the prototypical sacrifice is that of an animal ceremoniously butchered, followed by a festive banquet or a simple meal. The uncanny resemblance with the killing of a human person is heightened when the animal victim fulfills a vicarious role in the relation to the sacrifier, that is, the sponsor of the sacrifice, according to the sacrificial taxonomy of Henri Hubert and Marcel Mauss. The victim then redeems the sacrificer from death. For a historian of religion, it is convenient to define sacrifices as a subgroup of offerings, with votive offerings as its extreme contrast, that is, gifts to the gods that become their own, for example, within a temple precinct. Despite these differences, a sacrifice follows the basic structure of an offering, which establishes and maintains communication with the hidden world of the gods. And mostly an animal sacrifice is surrounded by non-bloody offerings of, for example, incense, fluids, and vegetarian substances. Implicit in most discourses on religion and violence is a political dimension in which violence is seen as something to be circumscribed in order to maintain or recover peaceful coexistence between antagonistic groups and identities. But sacrifice is not simply an act of killing or a ritualized murder, but is a way to sacralize, regulate and transform violence. That this process is sometimes destructive and run counter to universal rights and obligations is true, but sacrifice wedded to right reason highlights the question of necessary violence and its legitimacy. Sacrifice is therefore intimately connected to central ethical questions. The sacrificial mechanism is a kind of creative destruction. It sacrifices something of lesser value for a higher goal. It reinforces a hierarchy of values, prestige and power. An animal is sacrificed to please a god, but also in order to provide food for a group of human persons. The sacrificial ritual often involves a sense of guilt and acts of reparation toward the animal species. It recognizes obligations and shows gratitude, for example, by returning the firstborn and the first fruits to the gods. The opposite of the sacrificial principle is found in the industrial handling of animals and in the mechanized, disenchanted business of modern warfare. Without a sacred space and sacred time of sacrifice, without the ethical recognition that the real sacrifice is of one's own self, for which one might put forward substitutes, the ethical dimension gives way to instrumental rationality that knows no boundaries but coolly calculates the most efficient methods of killing. The apotheosis of this mindset is of course the nuclear and hydrogen bombs, death the destroyer of worlds. To analyze sacrificial traditions from the perspective of violence leads the researcher to a reflection on modernity, and thus the very context of the scholarly enterprise. The question is whether the modern age has in fact in any decisive sense transcended the long, violent prehistory of humankind. Or is there, beneath the surface of technological civilization, a deeper level of ferocious animality which has been molded by millennia of hunting and tribal warfare, and which was the driving force behind the later massive sacrificial cults of agrarian cultures, but also, as in the case of the Aztecs, the principle behind large-scale sacrifices of men and women. Are the devastating modern wars only the latest manifestations of these principles? The First World War was for many a brutal awakening to the realities of the sacrificial principle. The unprecedented scientific progress of the 19th century and the optimism accompanying it died in the trenches of northern France. The horrifying Holocaust, only 3 decades later, of mainly European Jews, reinforced the insight of the unlimited cruelty man is capable of. No sacrifice is too large or extreme. Such a concern with the destructive nature of man and the precarious prospects of modern civilization animated both René Girard and Walter Burkert, who published their seminal books on violence and sacrifice in the beginning of the 1970s. The scapegoat mechanism highlighted by Girard and the ritualization of the hunt with the necessary killing of the prey, which then turned into a sacrificial victim, are similar but different. Girard increasingly came to see Christianity and the death of the supremely innocent victim, Jesus Christ, as that which transcended the violent mechanism scapegoating and thus also sacrifice. Burkert, on the other hand, saw merely different attempts to conceal the violent nature of man with a thin cover of civilization, which probably would produce tragic results in the end. In this way, the anthropological reflection on the violent or basically peaceful nature of man is also a reflection on the prospects of modernity, the grand attempt to create a civilization without the help of the gods and without divine grace. However, this supposes that man is basically good, that at heart human persons are governed by constructive and socially beneficial instincts and principles. If the disorder of the human person is not only due to external factors, but proceeds from a deeper disruption or corruption, then it highlights a tragic nature of modern secular society, which ultimately rests on the basic goodness of human nature. Pure reason used with decadent motives produces institutions like Auschwitz, Gulag, and totalitarian surveillance states like that of present-day China. Anthropological and sociological theories probe the unconscious causes of sacrificial violence and its analogical phenomena in modern societies, as soldiers sacrificing themselves for the nation. For a religious person, however, sacrifice makes sense only when understood in its proper religious world. One can therefore investigate instead the meaning and role of concrete sacrifices, and sacrifice as an idea, a metaphor, covering also, for example, asceticism and self-denial in general. The role of Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son Isaac, or Ismail in Islam, as commanded by God in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, is a central case. In fact, traditional Christianity is incomprehensible when the sacrificial death of Jesus on the cross is neglected as that which fulfills what the sacrifice of Isaac could not. The focus of such studies is then on the religious mind, the world created by ritual sacralization, by powerful creation narratives, and not primarily a focus on the precarious ethical program of liberal modernity. In this presentation, I do not have the time to do a thorough exegesis of the writings of Burkhardt and Girard, the most well-known scholars of sacrificial violence, or delineate the sacralization processes created by the religious mind, but my intention is instead to focus on the situated nature of scholarly reflections on sacrifice and violence, especially as it concerns human nature. If we at this graduate seminar discuss the ritualization of first fruit offerings, we can situate them in a pre-modern agrarian context, suitably distant from the urban setting of a typical research university. Or when analyzing jihadi martyrdom and acts of terrorism founded on a sacrificial ideology, we see ourselves as peering into the dark heart of religious fanaticism, which by definition is absent from the functionalist seminar room and is taken for granted human rights value foundation. But when linking sacrifice to violence, questions of human nature and civilization come to the fore as obviously the 20th century was not the most peaceful. Indeed, science and technology put the survival of the human race in question. We cannot therefore disregard that when linking sacrifice to violence, we also undermine the clear Enlightenment distinction between, on the one hand, religious pre-modern forms of thinking and societal formations, and on the other hand, modes of thought and social life flowing from the emancipated human reason. We are still violent. We still sacrifice our enemies. While writing this text, the collapse of the project of creating a liberal democracy in Afghanistan is unfolding, with a deadline only a few days off. And we still remember the dramatic spectacle of online executions performed by the ISIS in Iraq and North Africa, and the anniversary of September 11th is approaching. The scholarly reflection on sacrifice thus entails self-scrutiny. Ritual sacrificial violence is a mirror image in which we see ourselves more or less clearly and must pass ethical judgment on our deeds. Even if we take the position of many scholars of religious studies, a post-metaphysical stance of value neutrality and non-confessionality, and only report on the unvarnished truth of sacrificial violence, we cannot escape that with our proposal of truths about the human condition, we are also setting the parameters for possible forms of civilization. For Émile Durkheim, the most prominent sociologist of the early 20th century, and a man who dealt prominently with religion, this interconnection of life and scholarship had tragic consequences. In his writings, he speculates and even promotes a future secular religion that has the sacred aura of the traditional metaphysical religions. For him, the gods are merely symbols of the social group itself, and therefore the religious acts, including sacrifice, are inflected towards society, which is the real God. For Durkheim, individualism, that is liberalism, is not only a religion among many, but, quote, is henceforth the only system of beliefs which can ensure the moral unity of the country, end quote. He even states, quote, this is why man has become a god for man, and it is why he can no longer turn to other gods without being untrue to himself, end of quote. On February 21st, 1916, the Battle of Verdun began symbolically by that a German artillery grenade hit the cathedral that was built already in the 10th century. One more meaningless, extended slaughtering began, which in the end demanded up to 300,000 dead and 500,000 wounded. 4 days later, it was announced that André, Durkheim's only son, had died. He was shot already in December 1915 at the Bulgarian front and died later by his wounds. Durkheim cried, but made sure he was busy working. He wrote to a friend, quote, of course, I know that the religions are there and that their practices are rich in experience that is unconscious and full of accumulated wisdom, but their wisdom is crude and empirical. Nothing resembling ritual practices has been of use to me or seems effective to me, end of quote. The nation had required its sacrifice, his only son, and the new religion, the cult of humanity, could not help him. Durkheim never recovered, but became increasingly thin and feverish. Toward the end of 1916, when he left one of all these committee meetings for the French war effort, he had a stroke. He survived, but died a year later, and after another year, the war was over. In this seminar, we are connecting a Swedish scholar living and working in Norway with a graduate seminar in Sao Paulo, Brazil. All of us are affected by a global pandemic that has killed hundreds of thousands of men and women, and which has closed our societies in ways unimaginable only a few years ago, when globalization had an aura of irresistibility. My point with this talk is that when we begin to reflect on sacrifice and violence, we are also reflecting on our common humanity and the present situation. Is it tragic? Despite good intentions, flowery speeches and signed treaties, we have to sacrifice. Driven by the survival instinct, righteous intentions or pure egoism, we shed blood. Peace is merely a fleeting moment, and with the arrival of crisis, hard principles come to the surface. The central question of the study of sacrifice in this self-reflective mode is whether we are capable to transcend our violent nature. Suppose ritual sacrifice is not only a reflection of necessary violence, as the hunt or butchering for eating animal flesh, but perhaps more accurately, it is a mechanism to transform instinctual, destructive principles. And in a second step, voluntary self-sacrifice, as found in ascetical movements, questions maximizing profit, pleasure, and power. In this way, sacrifice is crucial for any ethical stance that rejects egoism. But it can also be used for terrifying violence, as in terrorism. As for Durkheim, Girard, and Burckhardt, our own theories of sacrifice has consequences for our life. A sacrifice is an act of communication with our gods. The Christian transcendent God, one of the many gods of Hinduism, or one of the modern gods, such as the nation. What is lower is sacrificed for what is higher. Sacrifice then not only puts ethical pressure on the individual, but also on the social group. If the sacrificial principle is in some way part of our human nature, fashioned throughout millennia, then it cannot simply be rejected as part of earlier stages of civilization, something we have outgrown. But we must come to terms with its ethical demand. In a sense, we are, as Durkheim and Abraham, long before him, destined to live the terrifying prospect of a God requiring us to sacrifice our most valued possession, in this case our child, our future. Even a scholarly theory of sacrifice sets the scene for an answer to whether and how the sacrificial principle can be sublimated, transcended, or if we are simply helpless before its power. From ritual through ethics to civilization, sacrifice is a red thread of human history.
Oh, thank you so much for this reflection on a very interesting and challenging issue, and quite actual, as you told us, as you showed us when you gave us some examples for contemporary sacrifices in terms of pandemic, for example. This is interesting. We have to talk about it, of course. We will do this, but first of all, I would like to invite anybody to start with the questions so that we can enter into the debate. I have two questions, but I won't ask them now because I think our audience should have the preference now. And could you please articulate themselves? Pessoal, caros e caras amigas e amigos, vocês poderiam agora fazer algumas perguntas, comentários. A gente vai receber esses comentários, perguntas no chat. Eu vou traduzir essas perguntas e depois vou traduzir as respostas do Clemens. Bom, estou esperando aqui. Se precisar um pouco de tempo de pensar sobre um tema bastante complexo, talvez eu comece. Fábio, você tem uma pergunta? Ou Edin? Senão, eu vou fazer minhas. Well, I would start with my question because nobody is reacting now, Clemens. I will first do them in Portuguese. Afterwards, I will translate them. A primeira pergunta que eu vou fazer ao Clemens é a questão sobre uma teoria de Max Weber, uma observação de Max Weber, que fala sobre a etização da religião, a transformação de uma religião do tipo que Clemens nos apresentou, né? Uma religião talvez mais mágica, né? Você faz um ritual numa escala menor para provocar uma reação beneficente maior, né? através de sacrifício. Eu vou perguntar se ele levou em consideração esta modificação. A primeira pergunta. A segunda pergunta é, eu gostaria de saber que ele poderia talvez operacionalizar um pouco mais a questão do sacrifício. Porque como ele trabalhou com a questão do sacrifício e chamou ou deu-nos exemplo da pandemia, eu achei uma definição relativamente vaga, relativamente aberta para vários fenômenos. Eu não sei se isso totalmente serve para a nossa análise daquilo que acontece no mundo religioso. Well, I will have two questions. I think they are interrelated. The first one is the following. Following Max Weber, we can say that there is a shift in religious history from more magical religiosity, where sacrifice is an integrative element of this kind of religiosity. And then you have a more ethical approach by the so-called great world religions. And this ethicization is a so to say, a sublimation of this violence and this expression of violence directly through a sacrifice. I would like to know if you have thought about it, if you have taken into consideration this modification in the history of religions, and if yes, how can we still use the issue or the concept of sacrifice in this context? You gave us some examples. This is the second question, interrelated. When you, for example, quoted the terrorist attacks or pandemic example, given the example that we have to sacrifice our personal interest for the sake of the good society, of the welfare of society. And my question is, it seems to me that it's a quite generous or quite vague conceptualization of I think here you lose the analytical potential which is behind the concept of sacrifice. I will give you an example. For example, Buddhism. I would like to know if you have any example where this sublimation of sacrifice is present within Buddhism. I take this example, or I give this example only to problematize if this is really a universal category, or it is quite specific, related to monotheistic religions, for example, or religions of the past, tribal religions, for example. I don't know if it's clear what I would like to know, Clemens. If not, I'm happy to clarify better, if you like.
Thank you very much for the question, and thank you very much for inviting me to this seminar. It's quite wonderful to be present, although I don't see you students, so I don't know who you are. So this is a little bit anonymous, but whoever you are, I'm grateful to have this opportunity to discuss with you and to speak with you. And as usual during the pandemic, it's upsets our ideas about what a university is, what is a professor, what is a student, and so on. I find it quite refreshing sometimes, even though I miss meeting students and teachers. But in Norway and Sweden, we are now back to campus education. So we're more or less back to usual, but not in Brazil, as I've understood. So your question is, of course, crucial for, say, analyzing sacrifice. I've written a very small booklet on, like, a short introduction to sacrifice in Swedish. It's not in English yet. But of course, this transition which happened, which you can see in the texts, in the first millennium before Christ, in the middle of the first millennium before Christ, we can see it happening in several different cultural spheres, civilization at the same time. And one of them is India. You referred to Buddhism, for example. A great, say, a great reflection on sacrifice was taking place, and on religion and what religion was about was taking place in India in the middle of that millennium. And Buddhism is just one result of it. And what we can see is I've written one book which focuses this more, which is on ritual interiorization. So generally, the Vedic rituals, which were very much concerned with elaborate sacrifices and intricate ritual sequences and so on, the reflection started to focus on the interior of the human being, on intention, on the mind, but also on more physical interior principles. And they become more and more important. And of course, that affected sacrifice, because that was also connected with, say, rejection of bloody sacrifices. But sacrifice as a principle was not rejected, for example, in, say, Brahminical Indian culture. So it's more like the asceticism was seen as a kind of sacrifice. And if you proceed further on in Hinduism, you will see in the Bhagavad Gita, the central question revolves about how to reinterpret sacrifice, not only as to say meditation, this interior principles of human action, but also as ethical actions, because you renounce your say motivations or the results of the action. But this happens at the same time with the prophets in the Old Testament, where you could see things like God saying, I don't want sacrifices, I want like good deeds or something similar, or upright intentions. And you have that also inherited by Christianity. But of course, at the same time, you have the old Greek philosophies. So it's a kind of general civilizational change going on, which gave birth to the idea of an axial breakthrough through different cultures at the same times. And we are still, and modernity inherited these ideas of a kind of interior sacrifice. But with this, it's always, when you focus on the interior, it always requires outer signs. So in the sense, the ritual acts of sacrifice are the outer signs of an interior, interior attitude or intention and so on. And then you could see like Christian martyrs as sacrificial acts and so on. And I think any discussion of sacrifice will move between these exterior acts and the interior, between ethics and between the sacralization of religious rituals. And what I tried to kind of focus on here in my talk was it concerns what is a human person, what is human nature, when we especially connected to violence. And that's, of course, a focus on the interior. Do we have within us this sacrificial principle? Like Girard said, for example, the scapegoat mechanism, that we have a kind of a psychological, social need to sacrifice an individual to have peace in the group. And of course, that's an interior principle, but it happens in that's physical consequences. So, of course, when when one looks at these different traditions, one will see that the concept and words for sacrifice and reflections on sacrifice extends into other realms, like ethics, for example. If we look at Christianity, it's a complex relationship, because the death on the cross was the final sacrifice, the ultimate sacrifice. At the same time, you have in Catholic theology, for example, the idea that this perfect sacrifice becomes present in the Eucharist celebration, for example. And then that is connected to interior, individual, sacrificial attitudes and acts. So in my little short book, I connect that. I look at two Catholic saints focused on the Sacred Heart spirituality, which has this very, very explicit sacrificial spirituality. It was a very long answer.
Thank you very much, Clemens. I will try to sum up some of your explanations. First of all, I'm really sad that we don't have access to your Swedish book. Maybe it can be translated first to English and then we will translate it to Portuguese. Isso foi uma pergunta relativamente longa, mas a ideia principal é a seguinte. Quando o Clemens se refere à questão da violência, ele fala mais no sentido de uma constante antropológica, algo que está dentro do ser humano e que sobreviveu. Você olha para o passado, vendo esses sacrifícios de animais, por exemplo, às vezes seres humanos, isso você pode condenar do ponto de vista de hoje, mas olhando de maneira sutil ou mais detalhes, você percebe que, na verdade, esta atitude ainda está, ou faz parte, e vai fazer parte da natureza humana. O que muda é a manifestação dessa tendência antropológica. Ele fez a diferença entre o sacrifício exterior e sacrifício interior, que tem pouco a ver com minha pergunta sobre o budismo. Ele mostrou claramente, isso já pode ser visto nos Upanishads, por exemplo, ou outras religiões, jainismo, por exemplo, na Índia, onde os mesmos conceitos de sacrifício agora são internalizados e são reinterpretados, ressignificados, né? No sentido, você começa a elaborar determinadas, ou desenvolver atitudes de desistência, por exemplo, a disciplina da mente, a questão, inclusive, corporal, né? Eu diria, a figura do yogi, por exemplo, que é esse clichê, por exemplo, você pode ver como a própria pessoa está se sacrificando em nome de um objetivo maior, que a religião promete ou vislumbra, né? Ele mostra, por exemplo, a Bhagavad Gita é um texto incluído no Mahabharata, por volta da Era Comum, 400 antes, 400 depois do Cristo, ou mais ou menos a fixação, onde você tem exatamente essa ideia do sacrifício em termos éticos, né? De uma determinada atitude que o adepto ou praticante tem que desenvolver, não apenas os atos rituais, os externos, mas agora uma atitude, uma maneira de se posicionar. Ele fala, por exemplo, os mártires cristãos, por exemplo, podem ser vistos exatamente nesse sentido. Então, a resposta à minha pergunta, em que sentido esta categoria do sacrifício é suficientemente discriminatória, ele diz sim, se você tem a ideia básica, né, que você dá algo em função de um objetivo maior dentro da religião, aqui você tem uma possibilidade de ver este fenômeno como algo universal e transhistórico em vários contextos, seja ritualístico, externo ou atitude ético interno. So we have another question. I will quote from the chat. Received this from Fabio Stern. The question is, I will quote it simply, and you can, I hope you understand what the student is really asking. In Brazil, there are African-based religions that still practice the sacrifice of animals for the consumption of meat by the community. They are criticized by ecological movements and people who do not fight industrial slaughter, nor by people who are not outraged by the violence of religious fundamentalists. How do you see the selective indignation that is against the sacrifice that will serve as food? I hope you understand what the question is. I'm sure that I'm not fully aware of the idea, but maybe you can do something out of it.
Yeah, I think there are two things here. Of course, the first thing is people's selective indignation, and that is, of course, dependent on who you are, in what context you are, what ideology you are part of, and so on. So it could be difficult for me to say anything about those who actually put forward this criticism, because I don't know who they are. So the explanation for that would be their larger worldview, so to speak, within which this is a problem and something else would not be a problem. But another thing where you could look at that, many religions, even world religions, have not moved beyond animal sacrifice. Islam is still performing animal sacrifice. There's a huge celebration each year connected with the Hajj, where Muslims are supposed to do animal sacrifices, and they do. It's, of course, in the Nordic countries, I don't think that happens very much. But if you go to like South Asia or somewhere else, there will be a lot of animal sacrifice, and that is directly dependent on the archetypical, sacrifice of Abraham, who didn't sacrifice his son, but sacrificed a substitutionary animal. And the same with the Judaism. Judaism, in a sense, has not transcended the sacrificial principle, but the temple was destroyed, where we were supposed to do all the sacrifices. So some Jewish groups want to rebuild the temple and start up again with animal sacrifices. And also in Hinduism, there are still performed animal sacrifices in Hinduism, most famously to Kali, the goddess Kali, the ferocious goddess. And there's one festival in Nepal, which has, of course, been the center of indignation of everyone who doesn't like animal sacrifice, because then hundreds of thousands of animals are killed on more or less on a large field. So it's a very brutal sacrifice. It's mostly these ferocious goddesses that require bloody sacrifices. So there are still I wouldn't say it's just like some small tribal religions that are still performing sacrifice. It's still quite widespread in that sense. And when it comes to Buddhism, I don't have that perfectly clear for myself. But then, of course, Buddhism has joined with many more local traditions, and so it's very dependent on what part of Asia you will look at, or what said the more substrate culture of that region would be. So I think it's wrong to say that religious sacrifices, that's animal sacrifice, or something that we have completely transcended in one sense. But of course, industrial slaughter is not a religious act. It's not even a cultural act somehow. It's this say efficient spirit of modernity, while say a smaller group that performs animal sacrifice in the say, public sphere somehow is performing a cultural act. But then this is part of when you discuss civilization, human nature, and sacrifice, when this industrial way of thinking takes over humanity, like in Auschwitz, where you have, which is called the Holocaust, which is a name for a sacrifice where the victim is totally consumed by fire. So it's sacrificial terminology. So that would be another question. So let's try another one.
Thank you so much, Clemens. Bom, a resposta é um pouco além da pergunta, ele voltou um pouco para a questão anterior, mas eu vou primeiro responder a pergunta do Ricardo. Acho que foi o Ricardo que fez a pergunta a respeito da questão de uma sociedade em que permite o sacrifício industrial, né? Tecnicamente bastante elaborado, tecnicamente bastante sofisticado, e ao mesmo tempo condenando grupos religiosos que ainda fazem, ou cuja prática ainda é marcada, ou pelo menos faz parte de sacrifício de animais. E ele falou, primeiro é a questão de valores, né? Obviamente que existem numa sociedade pluralista várias referências éticas, e aqui seria no primeiro momento a questão. A questão por trás desse debate é simplesmente que você tem um contexto religioso e você tem um contexto não religioso, que seria a máquina industrializada de matar animais para ter alimentos. E ele fala isso nem um ato cultural, é um ato que é permitido, promovido por um avanço tecnológico, né? Então, aqui tem uma percepção seletiva, né? Que está por trás dessa discussão. Não pode dizer que é inconsequente, é simplesmente um outro contexto em que esses debates acontecem. Um religioso e outro não religioso, nem cultural, mas mais tecnológico. Assim, depois ele voltou para trazer exemplos da história da religião que questiona um pouco, relativiza um pouco minha primeira pergunta sobre a modificação da religião na história das religiões, né? Uma tendência de uma etização da religião em vez de uma externalização em termos de sacrifícios. Ele falou, olha para as grandes religiões do mundo. O Islã, por exemplo, ainda tem sacrifício de animais, né? No momento da peregrinação, Hajj, para Meca, uma das cerimônias, um dos rituais, ou uma das partes desta peregrinação é o sacrifício de um animal. Lembrando a este sacrifício arquetípico do Abraão, né, que sacrifica um animal em substituição a seu filho, né? Fala também o judaísmo. O fato de que não existem mais sacrifícios no judaísmo tem muito a ver com a destruição do templo. Quer dizer, não é necessariamente uma evolução interna do judaísmo, onde o judaísmo se afasta dessa prática de sacrifícios animais, mas é simplesmente, vou dizer, uma obrigação externa pela destruição, onde você não tem mais lugar para o sacrifício, né? E ele cita exemplos também do hinduísmo, né? O hinduísmo é uma religião muito diversa, tem várias tendências, entre elas também onde você tem ainda sacrifício de animais, por exemplo, dedicadas ao deidade Kali. Kali é uma das consortes do Shiva, muito ligado ao Cálcuta, a cidade de Cálcuta, onde você tem ainda, e essa é sempre a iconografia de Kali, é sempre com sangue, assim, parece violenta, e aqui você tem um sacrifício ainda da comunidade local. E ele cita também o festival em Nepal, onde tem uma cerimônia onde centenas de animais são sacrificados em um determinado momento do ano, né? Quer dizer, esses exemplos mostram uma certa... Isso, aqui tem uma imagem do Kali, por exemplo, né? Então, corresponde, né, a imagem, a ideia do sacrifício a ela. E, nesse sentido, a gente não pode dizer que tudo mudou. Pelo contrário, o fato que esses cultos ainda, ou esses rituais ainda existem nas religiões, aliás, salientam, né, o argumento do Clemens, né, da razão a ele. Well, there's another question made by Marcel Senna, one of our students. He asked if you could elaborate upon your mention of ascetism, ascese, né, as a voluntarian sacrifice. Could you please the relation of this voluntary sacrifice in terms of the expiatorio, I don't know what is the English word, the bode expiatorio, agora não sei como se chama. Well, the idea is that I don't know the equivalent of a Portuguese word. I hope you could elaborate a little bit on this idea, please, again.
On asceticism and self-sacrifice?
Yes, exactly. And what is the function for the society? What is the why is this important for society?
If we look at India, for example, where we have this breakthrough in the middle of the first millennium before our era, where we got a context of many persons leaving society to dedicate themselves to, say, religious, metaphysical, philosophical questions and thinking and reflection, but also to asceticism. That is, they rejected the bodily life, both the social life and the bodily life, to search for what was beyond, what was spiritual, what was within the human being and outside of the material cosmos. So in that context of asceticism, self-sacrifice becomes something special, both that you sacrifice the body for the soul, but you also in this context where you start to reflect on ethical principles, and you realize that the older principles, that if I perform lavish sacrifices and give a lot of things to the gods, they will give me a lot of good things as well. I will have pleasure, I will have a rich good life here on earth and in heaven. And that was rejected by these new moments who said that is too little. And for example, if you go to Buddhism, you will have all these heavens. Many think like there are no gods in Buddhism. There are a lot of gods in Buddhism, but they occupy these different heavens, and eventually they fall down because they're just living up their karmic points, so to speak. But you have to break through from this whole system of pleasures, of bodily, social, say, benefits, and so on. And in that sense, you are sacrificing with asceticism your body, but in this reflection on, okay, so what is a human being? What is it to be a human person? If the body is not me, I'm not my body. And then the Indian thinkers started to think, but I'm not even my psyche either. My personality is not me. So they search and search, the kind of mystical, metaphysical search, that eventually came to this very abstract principle of, say, consciousness of the individual being, and a kind of, in some movements, like Brahman, a more cosmological, metaphysical principle beyond the whole material cosmos. So in that sense, self-sacrifice fulfills an antisocial function, so to speak. And I think that's an extremely important function. If you take Christianity, for example, some people will leave social life, they will leave the bodily life, so they will keep that to a low, being ascetics in that sense, keep it to the minimum and focus on things of higher value, contemplation, reflection, science, the soul, salvation, and so on. Every society needs these people. But then later on, the problem became, like I already spoke about Bhagavad Gita in India, how to reintegrate this into society. If everyone takes this kind of ascetical self-sacrifice seriously, nobody will be left to manage basic functions in society. Everyone will be out in the jungles, meditating, living on fruits and roots. So the whole idea was there to get this self-sacrificial principle into society. So, and then of course the hero of Bhagavad Gita is a warrior, and he by reflecting the ascetical ideology, didn't want to fight. He didn't want to kill his relatives, his old teacher, and so on. And the god who intervenes convinces him he must perform his duty, social duty as a warrior, and kill the enemy, uphold the order of society, so to speak. And then they reinterpret this self-sacrificial principle in a socially constructive way. So he, by doing his duty, he sacrifices his desires. The ascetic sacrificed his desires by going into the forest and renouncing most of the bodily, needs. So there you have this tension with self-sacrifice. One can go away from society, the other will kind of build up society. But then you also have the connection with violence. To be in society, you need to accept violence. Now I'm speaking for a long time. I'm sorry for Frank that he will have to kind of make that.
It's interesting. Oh, sorry.
One little point before that, and that the most extreme case, of course, is Jainism, where you take this idea of that every action you do leads to bad consequences. Karma is a kind of matter that clings to your soul. Even unconscious actions will lead to this. So the only solution is actually to do absolutely nothing, which leads that the ultimate goal is self-sacrifice in the sense of self-starvation. You starve yourself to death. You can look on YouTube, you'll find videos of people doing, mostly old people that kind of finished their way in this. But then it can be connected to environmentalist ideas, and where the idea is that the best thing would be for you to leave no footprint whatsoever, ecological footprint. So you just have to stop breathing, eating, more or less. You have to die to get that result. So I just took the Indian case just to show this, because the society here could be antisocial, but you could take the sacrificial principle, put it into this more socially beneficial.
A resposta vai um pouco numa outra direção. Eu acho que não foi exatamente o que o o Marcel tinha na cabeça, mas é super interessante. Eu vou resumir a resposta com muitos exemplos da religiosidade indiana, e com isso a gente tem que agora já pensar em concluir nosso debate, tá? Então, o primeiro exemplo que ele traz a respeito da relação entre aquele que pratica a ascese e a sociedade foi da época da contracultura indiana em reação ao ritualismo védico, né? Muito associado aos Upanishads, por exemplo. E a ideia é que, na verdade, a pessoa que se retira da sociedade para viver num ashram, no centro espiritual, por exemplo, isso é, na verdade, um ato antissocial. A sociedade não beneficia com isso, o indivíduo se beneficia, ele vai se retirar. Então, nesse caso, a gente pode dizer, é uma relação negativa entre sociedade e a prática da ascese, né? Então, ele vai é um ato antissocial, mas também anticorporal, por exemplo. A questão é que ele vai negar seu corpo, ele vai negar os aspectos relativos da sua personalidade, mente, assim por diante, na busca de uma... que ótimo, Fábio, assim com imagens assim, né? Vocês forem para ilustrar um pouco, né, o que é a ideia, né? Então, é individualismo, né, ascese nesse sentido. Na busca de libertação, na verdade, de todas as condições que são associadas à vida humana, né? Ele trouxe outros exemplos, trouxe, por exemplo, o jainismo como exemplo radical. O jainismo é convicto de qualquer ação, qualquer que seja, tem implicações negativas, né? Em qualquer momento você pode pisar num insecto e matar. Isso é violência. E na busca de evitar essa violência, a última consequência é fazer nada mais. É quase... existem alguns casos extremos onde pessoas não comem mais, porque tudo, na verdade, a preparação de comida tem implicações, não come mais e simplesmente morre por não mais alimentar o corpo, como consequência religiosa, né? Mas existe outro lado, ele cita a Bhagavad Gita, onde Arjuna, né, o herói do Bhagavad Gita, né, que é um príncipe, vamos dizer, um kshatriya, né, um guerreiro, dialoga com Krishna, o Deus Krishna, né, que na verdade diz para você, não, você faz parte da sociedade indiana, você tem deveres kármicos, seu dharma, sua tarefa, sua vocação na sociedade é lutar, né? Então ele estimula quase essa violência, né? E com isso seria a ideia que se você faz parte da sociedade como parte integral, uma das castas, por exemplo, você tem que aceitar a violência na sociedade. Então, esses são os dois extremos, né? O que eu acho fascinante em tudo isso que o Clemens nos falou é como uma categoria analítica, né? O sacrifício e a violência, duas categorias, como isso ajuda para fazer ciência da religião comparada, para ver como as religiões têm alguns elementos incomuns, muito relacionados à própria natureza humana, e quais são as diferenças históricas, contextuais, geográficas, né? Eu acho aqui o Krishna, né, uma das manifestações, né? A Mahabharata, né, o grande epopeia, fala Krishna em várias épocas da vida dele, né? Como aqui como pastor, né? Assim. Bom, isso é a minha avaliação, diria, não final, mas como aquilo que eu aprendi, além dos exemplos, da riqueza dos exemplos, para entender a relevância entre a história das religiões e a ciência da religião sistemática. É um exemplo muito interessante para nós, como um olhar específico, a partir de uma pergunta principal, né? O universo se abre dos fatos, dos dados históricos e permite um diálogo entre esses fatos, uma sistematização. Né? Clemens, I try to finalize our talk, not because we are out of questions or you are out of knowledge and information for us, but because the time is almost over, and we have we shouldn't extend too long to respect always also the platform, which is quite difficult for us for everybody. You also felt that the lack of contact with the audience is quite exhausting. We are talking to anybody and to nobody, né? Especially when the dialogue partner is not present and the screen. But I try to explain to tell them what I take out of your presentation, which is the importance of these two branches of religious studies: the historical research on singular traditions, religious traditions, and the systematic approach. And I think your contribution was that you offered a key to compare religions through two concepts, violence and sacrifice, interrelated concepts. But with this question, you are capable of doing of comparative research or comparative view on the religious traditions, both in a historical sense and in a geographical cultural sense. And I think this is what we try to implement in our students, that these two activities, they are complementary, and we need a key for analyzing religions to understand what religion in singular is and what are the constituents. And I think this for me, at least for me, was the great outcome of your talk. And I thank you very much for this. Don't know if Eugene would like to say something. I'm not sure, but it was not. We didn't talk about it. But if not, yes, maybe Eugene você pode talvez finalizar nosso evento. Pode ser em português se quiser.
Yeah, Clemens, I thank you very much for this speech. Deep diving in the knowledge about this concept, sacrifice and violence, and the importance for our understanding about our modern situation too. Then I thank you very much for this morning for us, of course. And I hope to receive you again in our program in another opportunity. We'll be very, very grateful for us.
In real life.
Real life.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
in real life. Ok, gente, foi um prazer ter vocês aqui. Eu vou passar a palavra para o professor Clemens falar as últimas, a despedida, e depois o professor Frank também pode traduzir para o pessoal. Clemens, if you want to say something, at least.
Sure. It's been an honor and a joy to be present in Brazil for a few, like 1.5 hours. And I'll just comment a little bit very shortly on what Frank said. And it's my whole process within history of religion has been to how to recapture this comparative dimension. It's a lot of fumbling around trying to find a way forward, because when I did my PhD, that was when this comparative phenomenological paradigm kind of fell down, so to speak, and nothing has really taken its place. So it's most things I do is kind of a way to find a way, at least which I think is good for doing this comparative studies of religion, because we can have endless, very specialized studies, but they tend to drift apart. And that's been my experience at these large conferences of history of religions. there's nothing that really keeps everything together anymore, except that it is not theology or something like that. So thank you very much once again for being present, and thank you, Frank, for translating me into Portuguese.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much. Eu gostaria resumir pouco, porque é muito interessante que o Clemens fala, corresponde totalmente da minha própria experiência. Então, ele falou, quando ele começou a estudar a história das religiões, a ciência da religião, ele começou a estudar no momento em que o paradigma antigo, a fenomenologia da religião, passou por uma crise e foi descartado pela maioria das universidades e programas na Europa, pelo menos na Europa. E para ele o grande problema é como a gente poderia substituir a fenomenologia da religião por uma abordagem não fenomenológica que cumpre a mesma função de evitar que todos os nossos conhecimentos se perde nos detalhes e a gente não tem mais uma chave para integrar esse conhecimento. E todos os seus esforços, que ele apresentou uma pequena parte aqui, tem a ver com essa busca maior para uma área de sistematização da religião, né? Não fenomenológica, mas funcional, né? E eu acho que ele trouxe minha última palavra agora mesmo, um exemplo como isso poderia funcionar. Tá? Thank you so much, Clemens, once again. E muito obrigado de todos a presença de vocês. E Jean, muito obrigado pela abertura e as palavras finais, e particularmente o Fábio pela intermediação e organização deste evento. Desejamos um bom dia para vocês e em breve a gente se revê de novo. Muito obrigado. Até mais. Thank you, Clemens. I would